Socio-economic development in Africa. Before starting this presentation, I would like to stress on the importance of tourism and the obstacles hindering the development of the sector in Africa. So as we know, tourism plays a vital role in the economy of several countries, for which it is a main source of foreign exchange earnings, a job-creating sector, and also a factor of socio-economic equilibrium. So tourism development also helps to revitalize other sectors, such as agribusiness, transport, constructions, and public works, or cottage industry and other tourism-related activities. So this is the case for many developing countries whose economic activity is dominated by tourism, which generates substantial revenues, but whose development is nevertheless constrained by the need for capital to support investment. So in order to cast light on the importance of tourism in the socio-economic development and the obstacles that still hinder the full expression of Africa's tourism potential, there are numerous, but four of them focus attention. So the first one is the spread of corruption in African societies, which has negative effects on political and socio-economic development, most notably the loss of value of work, the destabilization of moral values, the rise of extremism, and the spread of crime as a reaction to the collapse of values and the lack of equality of opportunity in many African societies. So corruption also imprints on the political systems of African societies, challenging the legitimacy, stability, or reputation. Here we can give an example. So what is happening today, for example, in Algeria, in my country. So the lack of good governance led the country to, let's say, it's kind of an uprising against the regime, because the president is looking for a fifth term. He's in power during 20 years, ill, incapable, and he's willing to be the president for the next elections, which be held in April of this year, 1990. Or terrorism in Sahel, in Somalia. So this is why we can say that the spread of corruption in African societies has negative effects on political, socio-economic, and tourism in particular. The second one is the high cost of airline tickets. So in Africa, very few countries have a national air transport company through which tourists can directly reach their destination. More expensive destinations will not always attract tourists with modest budgets. Thirdly, the lack of adequate reception facilities is also a challenge that African countries face if they really want to see their tourism sector take off. So beyond hotels, basic physical infrastructure, such as a well-developed airports, ports, and road and train networks, as well as NTIC facilities. So This is a map showing that many African countries are suffering from inadequate tourism, education, training, and lack of protection of the environment. But we will deal with this, point later on. So now, let's say, so the socio-economic influences of tourism. So there are many influences or socio-economic influences of tourism in the African continent. So the economic development requires the rational management of available financial resources and trade activities using the opportunities offered by geo-economic exchanges. So under these conditions, the success of an economic project remains closely linked to the financial capacities to be mobilized, as well as the way of conducting its implementation and its evaluation. So it's clear that the economic challenge facing the African continent is linked with the availability and mobilizable financial resources, their abundance, and their optimal allocation. So according to Adam Smith, in his famous book, Wealth of Nations, the goal of any global progress strategy is the use and reuse of financial resources in the geo-economic sphere. So in our research on global and sustainable progress, which is an objective of the African continent, we see that this project is inseparable from the human factor as the foundation and goal of development, knowing that the essential elements for achieving global progress are labor, capital, and land. In this study, tourism plays a significant role in economic progress because it affects job creation, wages, production, consumption, inflation, investments, and the balance of payments. So, the influence of tourism sector on employment. So deliberate and responsible acts if investment is aimed at both wealth creation and job creation, which is one of the major concerns of the government, which is to reduce unemployment. So promoting and encouraging private investment in the tourism sector as a credible and strong alternative to public sector failure is now an unavoidable necessity. In this context, it's necessary to create the conditions conducive to greater mobilization of the financial capacities of the national and foreign private sector in order, in the one hand, to safeguard the existing tourist infrastructures and the jobs that are attached to them, and on the other hand, to increase the national heritage by creating new infrastructures and tourist activities whose impact on employment can be considerable. So the impact will be all the more important as the tourism sector has a ripple effect on other economic sectors, thus contributing to the creation of multitude of indirect jobs. In addition to the impact on employment, which will become stronger and stronger as the tourism sector becomes more important in the national economy, investment in the tourism sector will contribute to the revitalization of tourism, local crafts, and the flourishing of local industries, until then ignored. It's also a component of the spatial planning policy. In a country belonging to East Africa, such as Kenya, whose economy dependent on the export of coffee, tourism is now, thanks to a voluntarist and targeted policy, the third source of the country's income in foreign currency and a large provider of employment. So tourism creates jobs and stimulates SME, small and medium-sized enterprise. growth. So in 2014, it represented 9% of world. I'm sorry. In this map, our data, we have got the international tourism revenue in 2016, and destinations with the strongest growth. So we see here, for example, the share of Africa is estimated to 36.2 billion. So 3% of global tourism revenue in the world. So, which is too small. So the destinations with the strongest growth in international arrivals compared to 2015, so we have got Nigeria, 634,000 plus 50%.5. We have got Togo, 65,000 plus 23.8, and Burundi, 56,000 plus 42.7. But Rwanda is doing better than the other countries due to its policy. So let's tackle, let's say the point of tourism development factors in Africa for adaptation to globalization and the challenges of the third millennium. So tourism is more and more destined to become one of the strategic sectors on which the African continent is putting, and this notwithstanding the evolution of the world tourism, which prints an overall dynamic of which we can not exclude ourselves. So it's certain that the tourism sector will experience new vitality because the development of the tourism industry and the growing role it plays in the progress and development of the national economy of several countries allowed it to win as an essential component of their economic policies. This vitality will also be stimulated by increasingly difficult competition at the global level. Competition which is a huge challenge for growing tourism industry. Many countries are in perpetual competition when it comes to promoting tourism in its different forms: cultural, historical, health, environmental. So on this basis, the reader will conclude that these constituents, are consistent with the characteristic of tourism products capable of reaching several global tourism markets. So in this universe of competition, Africa is not disarmed, since it holds a significant part of the world's historical and cultural heritage. The challenge for our continent is essentially to put in place the optimal exploitation and exploitation conditions of this heritage, thanks to a policy of support for tourism development that is sufficiently proactive and resolute. This includes promoting foreign investment and supporting domestic investment with incentives that are attractive enough to build momentum for the tourism sector. It's also a question of adapting the policy of promotion and support to tourist activities so that it responds to the foreign demand, but also to a national demand which expresses and structures itself more and more. Supporting the tourism sector and making it progress is now a necessity for our continent, which cannot overshadow a promising sector of the African economy and can make a substantial contribution to the financing of socio-economic development in several African countries. countries. So this can be considered from a series of devices and measures, including from my point of view, I think that a product or tourism projects such as the Saharan tourism is prospering in many countries such as Namibia or Algeria, when we can practice sand skiing, which is very, very useful for some countries in Africa. So the promotion and development of tourist products adapted to the exploitation of the diversity of natural, historical, cultural, and religious wealth into a specific demand for tourism of exploitation, culture, worship, adventure, as well as sports tourism. Like the rally or sand skiing in the region of Tarit in Algeria. It's a region situated in the Sahara, or let's say southwest of Algeria. Or the Kalahari Sahara in Namibia, which attracts more and more followers. For business tourism, Ivory Coast is gradually taking its marks. According to the Hospitality Report 2018, Abidjan is currently the third most popular African city by businessmen, just behind Nigeria and Morocco. So Abidjan is currently the third most popular African city. The Ivorian capital hosts more and more worldwide events, but also international organizations that choose the city as its headquarters, with the tourist flow estimated at 3,475,263 in 2017 against 3,083,022 or 246. The previous year. So Côte d'Ivoire recorded a 12.7% increase in the number of visitors to the country, said Cyril Nomel, who is the director of Jumia Travel Ivory Coast. So, one of the main tourism products in Africa is the cultural tourism. So, as we know, Africa has an invaluable historical heritage, architectural heritage, Tassili rock engraving in North Africa. Tassili is situated in the extreme south of Algeria. And the remains of Great Zimbabwe. The remains of Great Zimbabwe, which is because in the past, Zimbabwe and parts of Mozambique knew the emergence of a great empire or great kingdom called the Mono Motapa. So there are some great ruins remaining till today in that region. And it's proved as well that Africa had its kingdoms and empires. So there are some statistics. For example, according to the July issue of African Tourism Monitor last year, published by the African Development Bank, the continent earned 36.2 billion in revenue from 62.9 million international visitors in 2016, compared to 7.5 million in 1990, a sign of a significant upturn. So this issue analyzes the most recent data on the impact of tourism on the economics of Africa. So this map is showing the direct travel and tourism employment in Africa. So African tourism is still in the early phases of its development. So according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, so tourism is expected to contribute to $269 billion to the GDP of the continent and create 29 million new jobs by 2026. So by then, it's hope is African tourism will have gained ground and be well on its way to a thriving and stable industry. So this photo or picture showing the practicing of sand skiing in the region of Tarit in Algeria. So employment in the travel and tourism sector in 2006, full-time jobs. So yeah. So the promotion of national and foreign investments, and in particular the encouragement of private initiative that support the efforts of African states in the development of tourism through the deployment of tourist structures and dependent services throughout the country or the continent. Countries or, I mean, the continent, yeah. So the promotion and support of tourism investments in the areas to be promoted, poor in tourist infrastructures and holding heritage and know-how that only need to be developed, to be rehabilitated and known. So in addition to the revitalization of certain disadvantaged regions, such as a certain part of the Sahel countries, such as Niger, which are otherwise drained, such a policy will contribute to the balanced development of the national territory. So the multiplication of summer camps and their distribution throughout the African continent allows for its part to leave certain regions of their isolation and discover a tourist vocation hitherto ignored. I mean, in my communications, I don't give many, let's say, statistics in depth, but the main goal of my presentation perhaps is that the African continent or many African countries don't give importance to training in tourism. Even there are some national schools in some countries in Africa. So I think that it's urgent to make better use of current programs in order to modernize them and to focus on the training of trainers. And the main thing is to encourage post-graduation, I mean master and PhD, mainly since tourism has become a science having its own rules that must be studied at very high levels and in the most prestigious universities. From now on, the university will take charge of doctoral or thesis dissertations on the schemes of economics, tourism planning, and other topics related to tourism industry. To develop distance education to facilitate access to this kind of training for students from remote areas. to organize intensive training courses for managers and officials of the tourism sector in order to be aware of the latest techniques in the management, promotion, and development of tourist activities. So I know that there is a problem today. Some scholars refuse to recognize that tourism is a science, which its rules. So we can evoke today the term tourismology, science of tourism. Thanks to my friend, Jean-Michel Horner, ex-president of the University of Perpignan, who is in his précis de la science du tourisme, he's keen, or he wants to prove that tourism is a specialty and a science. So he used the term tourismology, science of tourism, la science du tourisme. But in France, we have another group who is against this idea that tourism is a specialty, or and Professor Erner or evocated a discipline or a science called geopolitics, which in the 30s was linked to the expansion of wars in Europe. And some scholars used the term geopolitics, but they did not recognize it as a science. So now geopolitics is part of the politics or political sciences, and a specialty as well. So this is why he's defending the idea that tourism is a science, est une science. So, I can repeat what I said before. So, we think that it's high time to recognize tourism as a science that has its own scientific rules. So knowing that geopolitics was not recognized as a science in the 1930s and was much more related to wars in Europe, but today it's recognized as a science and a specialty in political science. So thanks to my friend, Professor Horner, ex-president of the University of Perpignan, who published Précis de la tourismologie. Main factors is, one of the main factors is the strengthening the legislative and regulatory framework of the tourism sector, particular land planning and management. So we are confident that the ownership of these arrangements will be beneficial and will see the development of tourism in Africa, thus supporting the NEPAD strategy. The measures described above constitute, in the current state of the tourism sector, minimal measures to engage the sector on the path of the modernization, essential for its development, which will be beneficial for the economy of the African continent. At the end of this brief review of the prospects emerging from the tourism sector, it's clear that Africa has world-renowned and recognized tourist assets, allowing it to consider the development of all kinds of tourism products, cultural, culinary, Saharan, seaside, thermal, business, with equal success. So today it appears that governments in Africa are determined to implement a strategy that emphasizes the diversification of supply in order to cover both external demand and the domestic demand that is structuring and expressing itself. So the strategy also aims to give this sector the means to enable it to compete and to be able to gain shares in international markets. So, in this perspective, the professionalization of the sector, pardon. So, in this perspective, the professionalization of the sector, the adoption of modern management methods, the encouragement of open partnerships with domestic and foreign private capital, and the use of new mechanisms in the field of tourism marketing constitute the fields of action to enable Africa to consolidate the foundation of its tourism industry and to ensure successful penetrations of the international tourist market. There are the conditions that the tourism sector will strengthen its contributions to the development of the African continent and will be to adopt the principles of the NEPAD program for balanced and sustainable economic and social development. So with the resources and means at its disposal, Africa can look forward to this challenge with optimism and determination, but also with responsibility in the context of an approach involving all the partners concerned, a clean environment and a newfound stability. All of these measures will indelibly contribute to building a brand image for the future tourist destination of Africa. For example, the main problem facing the African continent in the field of investment. I give an example about a country situated in North Africa, which is Algeria. So the Algerian government is adopting the base of 51.49%. So it was the most important point in the conditions imposed. So provided that Algeria owned the majority of the capital for any new company in partnership with foreigners. So the foreign companies expressed the desire to conceal the rules of foreign investments approved by the finance law so that they can obtain greater freedom and greater opportunities in the field of investments. So noting that the base of 49.51% is behind the reluctance and fear of many foreign investors to enter the market, calling on the new government to provide incentive to foreign investors to be able to establish partnership opportunities for both parties. So it could be said that it's kind of a monopolistic policy applied by the Algerian authorities. So Algeria is the biggest country in Africa. Algeria has a potential, an economic potential. I mean, raw materials. Algeria can develop tourism. Algeria has many tourism products, such as Saharan tourism, or all the products which I mentioned before. But this policy in the investment field is hindering the foreign investors to invest in this country. So this is a picture of Sands King, the region of Tarit. There's some Anyway, so thank you for votre patience. Thank you. And if the assistants has, questions or.
Thank you very much, and please, it's now your chance to ask questions.
So the debate is open. Le débat est ouvert.
Exactly. And I'd ask you to keep your questions brief to enable as many voices as possible. And if you could briefly introduce yourself so we can get to know the audience, that would be excellent.
My name is Ulrich Wunsch from Germany. I have a suggestion, maybe not that much of a question, but a suggestion to the 4 points you made hindering tourism development in Africa.
Yeah.
I think that, at least for Europeans or Germans, the question of safety and security is a major issue. And you have travel warnings on almost all African countries, and so that's a very hard barrier to overcome.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to suggest another question, maybe in Germany, the tourism sector is having problems because it's a low wage and low skilled sector. So having a decent employment rate here, nobody wants to work in the tourism sector. Something that happens
So
here.
you mean in Germany?
Yeah, Germany, Switzerland, countries like that. I mean, you have a real problem of finding cooks or service personnel and other people.
Yeah, yeah.
To fill in the it might be a problem of
Question pertinente. Yeah. I mean, your first remark. Let's start with your first remark about the security in Africa. So this is due to the emergence of many terrorist groups linked with Al-Qaeda. But the problem is, for example, the Sahel region is one of the poorest regions in Africa. So the terrorists use this situation in order, let's say, to combat the French who are present in that region, or the French interests. But the bad governance is behind this kind of behavior. But the continent is working too hard. I mean, through its institutions, such as the African Union, and the collaboration or partnership. African countries and France or European countries in general, in order to make an end to these terrorist groups in that region. Not only Sahel, but you have got Nigeria as well, Somalia. Although Turkey is playing a role in making an end to terrorism activities in Somalia, or trying to safeguarding the state there, but it's still difficult. And I think we should adopt a strategy leading to make an end to this phenomena. And it's not dangerous, I mean, for Africa, only for Africa, it's for the world, Europe or the United States. So I think that it's high time for all the African countries, with some exceptions, Senegal, Ghana, South Africa, something like that, who are adopting, let's say, a good governance. So many African countries, in order to tackle their problems, socio-economic, political problems, they should adopt democracy. This is what is happening in Algeria. 5 terms. I think that 2 terms in office is enough. The second one, the second remark, what is happening in Germany and
Just an observation.
yeah,
Saturated market.
maybe yeah, or maybe there are other sectors where people are well paid in comparison with this sector. Okay. Another question? Yes?
Well, yeah, that answers part of my question, but I still wanted to ask. My intended question was, given that you give a lot of recommendations concerning the touristic sector and how
Yeah.
it can help the African community, you mentioned the increase of, they should encourage graduate masters,
Yeah.
PhD programs and the like. But my worry is just how do we approach these institutions, these corrupt institutions that act as a barrier, like you said, talked about security, that act as a barrier to hinder such a growth in tourism. Because I think an example, like in my country, I come from southern Cameroon, and in Cameroon we've had a president for the past, I think, 37 years now.
President Biya.
Yes, and he has gone for the 7th term.
Yeah.
So you can have
This is what I said before.
So how do we, I don't know, you talked about democracy, but how do we get into that? How do we
Yeah, I know that. There is a lack of political maturity, in the African societies. But it's difficult in some regions because Cameroon is living, let's say, or facing a problem between the south and the north, such as Nigeria, the north and the south. The Anglophones, or the Francophones, yeah. I think that the main reference for the African people in order to tackle this kind of problems is to return back to the 60s or 70s, when you had presidents like Muallimu Julius Nyerere. Even Tanzania, you know that Africa is, let's say, ethnicity is very, very strong in the continent. So Muallimu Julius Nyerere solved the problem by unifying all the tribes of Tanzania. The number is maybe more than 100. He united the people by encouraging the Swahili culture. It was the cement for the Tanzanian society. And this is why this country today is peaceful. There is no, and is an emerging country in Africa, in East Africa in particular. But your question was about the introduction of postgraduate studies.
Well, as one of the recommendations.
Yeah.
How we approach those institutions.
No, as we know, in England, in the United States, as tourism is important, the students can carry out research dealing with tourism, tourism management, cultural tourism. But in some countries, for example, let's say in France, they consider that tourism is not a science. Ce n'est pas une science. It's more professional. And this is why in France you can't find a student, for example, carrying out a PhD or a doctorate. There is no doctorate, there is a master, professional, master 1, which is professional. It's not academic. What I'm saying here is encouraging the academic, studies, such as the Master 2, Master 2, or doctorate or PhD. You can do it, for example, in England or the United States, but in France, no. And many African countries, especially in West Africa, they imitate, or let's say, they are under the influence of France. Even their curriculum in the universities, or, okay? So, it's high time for the University of Dakar or Abidjan or to introduce this kind of studies, in their universities. The problem is facing the Algerians as well. I was the General Director of the National School of Tourism in Algeria. And I got problems with the ministry. They didn't recognize, because I introduced an LMD, it's licence or BA, master and doctorate. They said that it's professional, it's not academic. And this is why I resigned from the Ministry of Tourism, and let's say decided to get back to the university.
In the name of time, we have to actually conclude there, but let's first of all express our sincere gratitude to the professor for an excellent speech.